Blue Dolphin here, and this is Task 2, where we're going to talk a little bit about the background on Linux. Let's get into it. So, where is Linux used? Well, it's fair to say that Linux is a lot more intimidating to approach than operating systems such as Windows. Both variants, though, have their advantages and disadvantages. For example, Linux is considerably much more lightweight, and you'd be surprised to know that there's a good chance you've used Linux in some form or another every day. Linux powers things such as websites that you visit, car entertainment control panels, and to back it up, for websites that you visit, this is likely going to be Apache, which is a really big HTTP service that's used on Linux and hosts majority of the websites out there. Then you have car entertainment control panels, point of sale systems. So if you are doing any type of PCI compliance, you're dealing with Linux because POS machines don't exactly have Windows or Mac on them. Critical infrastructure such as traffic light controllers, or industrial sensors. So believe it or not, all those, like every time you go through an intersection, you're likely passing by some Linux operating systems. And the reason for this is because it can be redistributed in a way that can't with Windows, but it's lightweight, it's easy to set up, and you don't need a lot of power to run it. Let's look at the flavors of Linux. So the name Linux is actually an umbrella term for multiple OSs that are based on the Unix system. Thanks to Unix being open source, variants of Linux have come in all shapes and sizes, suited for what the system is being used for. For example, Ubuntu and Debian are some of the more commonplace distributions of Linux because it is so extensible. You can run Ubuntu as a server, such as a website or a web application, or as a fully fledged desktop. For this series, we're going to be using Ubuntu. Now I'm just over here on the Red Hat page, and we're just going to talk about some of the different Linux distributions, but I just want to point out that the Linux distribution is an operating system built from the Linux kernel that supports user programs, repositories, and libraries. Each vendor or community has its own distro. Because it's open source, it's released under the GNU, General Public Licensing. So if you don't know, the GNU operating system is all about free software and making it open source and free. And this is where the term copyleft comes in. So we all know what copyright is, but copyleft is, hey, I made some software and you can use it and modify it, but you can't modify it and redistribute it or sell it or make a profit on it in any way or call it yours if you take my version and change it a little bit. Jumping back over to the Linux distros, there's a little section here on enterprise versus community Linux distros. And typically, obviously, your community distros are going to be free and primarily maintained through the open source software development community, which is here, the GNU, supported by the Free Software Foundation. I forgot the name of the individual who started this. There's a documentary on him. Really cool, really neat how the history kind of started. I definitely recommend looking into it. However, when it comes to enterprise or commercial Linux, we're just looking at applications that are supported and have typically on-demand support staff, or they're updated very regularly, and they're asking for money, of course. But the primary distribution or difference is who decides what's important to users. So a community distro direction is set by contributors who choose to maintain packages from the wide variety of open source software options. The direction of an enterprise distribution is set by the vendor based on the needs of their customers. So if we look at the Fedora project, for example, it's an upstream community distro of Red Hat Enterprise Linux because it costs money for Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And the Fedora project is the community version, the free version. And tons of people contribute to it to make it that ideal release. And this isn't just some willy-nilly project. This is an actual stable release that's licensed, that has professionals backing it up. Okay. Let's get into the popular types of distributions. So we have Android, obviously we all know about that. Then we have Arch Linux, which as I understand it, is like a very bare bones type of Linux that has nothing on it and allows you to decide what you want to put on it. Then we have Centos, and Centos or CentOS is derived from the Red Hat Enterprise Linux platform. And again, it's a community version. Then we have Debian Linux, which obviously is what Cali Linux sits on, but Debian, also known as Debian GNU Linux, because it of course uses the free software, the open source software, but it's a Linux distribution composed of free and open source software developed by the community. And it was established back in 1990s at some point. Okay, and then we have the Elementary OS, and this is like the Linux version of Mac. I've never used it, but the idea was it was kind of a replacement to Mac OS. Don't really know much about it other than the desktop environment is called Pantheon. Fedora, we again covered, this is a community version of Red Hat Linux. Then we have Gen 2 Linux. So Gen 2 Linux is interesting. It's a little different in the sense that the Linux distributions are built using the Portage package management system. So unlike binary software distributions, the source code is compiled locally according to the user's preference and is often optimized specifically for something in mind. Now, they do have like pre-compiled binaries that you can buy or whatever. However, the name of this Linux distribution was chosen to reflect the potential speed improvements of machine-specific optimizations. And it was named after the Gen 2 penguin, which is like a really fast, or the fastest swimming penguin out there. Okay, let's look at Kali Linux. So Kali Linux, that's a security distribution. If you're working in security, you're going to be using Kali Linux for offensive security, typically. Then we have Linux Lite, which is just a really light version of Linux, again, with a GUI or a GUI. I've never used it. It does include, though, a set of light applications pre-built into it. All right, then we have Linux Mint, which is a nice and lighter version of Linux that could be used at home, but I believe it has kind of a focus or an emphasis on multimedia usage. So I've heard of people using it for kind of setting up like their own streaming service in their house, video server. But from what I understand, Linux Mint is really good for beginners because it has a lot of multimedia support that we might find ourselves using, like video players, Adobe, for example. So it's really based around kind of that home user experience. And it was created, I think, 2005, 2006. Then we have Manjaro Linux. Manjaro Linux, I've never used it, but I know it's a distribution based on Arc and it's user-friendly. That's really all that I know. Then there's MX Linux. I don't even really know the point of it, to be honest. I just never looked into it, never used it, but I understand that it's very friendly, it's elegant, it's efficient with desktops, it has high stability and solid performance, and integrates well with hardware. Then we have Open Sways. From what I understand, it's very good for laptops, deskbooks, netbooks, servers, multimedia center PCs in homes or small offices, and you can use it on an ARM or PPC computer. And it's pretty up there. I don't know a ton about it, but I have heard really good things in terms of like user experience and out of the box. All right, then we have some other ones. We're not really going to talk about these ones. Don't know much about them. Then we have obviously Ubuntu. Ubuntu's a big one out there. A lot is based off Ubuntu. But otherwise, let's jump over to TryHackMe here. And we will complete this task 2. Oh, it looks like we actually have a question. What year was the first release of the Linux operating system? So I think it was around the 2000s or 1900s. I know Linus Torvalds created it, but I'm just going to look it up here. I'm going to try I'm going to try a couple here. I think it might be 1991. Yeah, it's 1991. And that's what I see here on Wiki, 1991. Perfect. Okay, well, that's it. See everyone in the next video.